Yeah, so let me start off by just giving you a warm welcome to our first webinar. The webinar series we have is called Realizing the Strength and the Resilience of Children and Family Social Work in Commonwealth Nations. And so today is the first of three webinar series and webinars we'll be having in the series. And yeah, just wanted to give you a warm welcome. What we're planning on doing is I will take you through the housekeeping first, and then after the housekeeping, David, I'll hand over to you so that you could maybe just start with giving an overview of COSW, and so people can better understand how everything slots in within the social work profession. So yeah, so just a warm welcome, and then just to mention that in this webinar, we are aiming for this to be a safe space for discussion. And so, yeah, not what we'd want people to do is to allow space for people's voices to be heard. Sensitive content may be upsetting for some people. So please, at any stage, take a break at any point in time during the presentation. We'd like you to have your microphones on mute and also your cameras off unless you're invited to speak, just to just to lessen any form of distractions. And I myself, once I've finished speaking, I'll turn my camera off and my microphone so that the speaker who has your attention will be the only visible person on screen. The session is recorded and will be uploaded later onto our website. So if ever there's something that is really grabbing your attention, you still have access to that information afterwards. And you can always email us on the COSW email address if you want to have access to the presentations. We also slides, the presentation slides too. The chat box will be visible to the speakers and the attendees alike. So please be respectful, and I'm sure you would be, because you are social workers. So I just wanted to highlight that. I do want to mention that it may be difficult for us to monitor the chat for questions. You will have time to have discussion, raise possible questions in the breakout sessions and near the end of the webinars. So if we could maybe just limit the questions within the chat in order for us to manage the flow of today's webinar series. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to you, David. So yeah. Well,
great.
Thank you.
Can you hear me, Carleen?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Carleen, for all the hard work that's gone into organising this first ever webinar for associates of the Commonwealth Organisation for Social Work. This is a new initiative for us, and it's really good that we have this platform, which we hope will develop, and people will be able to share experiences and make contact with each other. So I've been asked to say just a few things about COSW, the Commonwealth Organisation for Social Work. We are an accredited organisation by the Commonwealth Secretariat, so we have a formal link with the Commonwealth structures, and this gives us various rights of access and the opportunity to speak with the Secretary General and with staff in the Commonwealth Secretariat. But how did we start? Well, we started with a Malaysian social worker, Anthony Tan, who had a Commonwealth Fellowship, and he came to meet me when I was working for the British Association of Social Workers, and he said, look, there are all these organisations of different professions active in the Commonwealth, but social work is absent, and we need to have a voice in the Commonwealth corridors. And I have to say, at that time, we said, well, why would anybody be interested in the Commonwealth? It's a legacy of empire. It's got all these negative associations. And why should we get involved? And he said, well, it isn't that. It is more, and it is worth it. And certainly if all these other professions like nursing and doctors and architects and planners and archivists and museum organizers, and there are now getting on for 100 of these different organizations, social work should be there. So we had a meeting in Colombo in Sri Lanka in 1994, and people there said, yes, we should get involved. It's important. And our colleagues in Africa and Asia were very enthusiastic that we should make sure that the voice of social work was heard in the Commonwealth. And that's what we have tried to do. That is our mission, that is our activity, is to make sure that the voice of social work contributes to dialogues, the discussions within the Commonwealth. And we've been quite successful in doing that in various ways. We have a new constitution we just implemented, which has a council, and in theory there should be a member of the council from every Commonwealth country. There are 56 of them. At the moment we're just building that up, but if your country does not have a representative, I see there are some of the representatives here on the screen. Rasika from Colombo from Sri Lanka is there, and Carleen is a member for the UK. We have almost 20 different countries now on the council, and we're welcoming more as we go. So if you're interested, you can look at our website and see our newsletter and the activities that are happening. So just to finish, Carleen, COSW aims to make sure that the voice of social work, the experience of social workers, is heard and recognised and respected within the Commonwealth. We do that by being involved with ministerial meetings, with the Secretariat, and working jointly with our partners, our colleagues from the other professions. And if you look at our website, you will see all that activity. It's an easy to remember website address, www.cosw.info, Have a look and see there. And if you are not yet an associate, you can sign up to become an associate. And that's very easy to do at the moment. There's no charge. And we would love to have you as part of that Commonwealth grouping, making sure that social work's voice and experience influences the Commonwealth policies. Carleen, I hope that was a sufficient introduction, and back to you.
Thank you. That's excellent, David. And you I'm sure you'll put in the chat, you know, the details you just read off of the website for people to access. So thank you for that, David. So it gives me pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Hugh Salmon, and he will introduce himself to you much better than I would be able to. But I'm just really pleased, Hugh, that you agreed to, you know, give some of your time just to share with us the work you are doing and how at such an important time it is important for us as colleagues all to draw together, not just within our country specific activities, but more globally. So over to you, Hugh.
Thank you so much, Carleen, and it's lovely to be here. So yeah, as Carleen mentioned, I'm Hugh Salmon. I'm the director of the Global Social Service Workforce Alliance. We're a global organization. We're registered in the US, but we work all over the world. I actually work from home in London as the director. We were set up in 2013. Obviously the International Federation of Social Workers has been there for a very long time and has a very key role in bringing together the national associations of social workers, and obviously it works very much in conjunction with yourselves in the Commonwealth organization. But the specific reason for launching an alliance focused on the social service workforce was to take into account the wider workforce, not just professional social workers, but paraprofessionals and volunteers. So I'll talk about that in my next slide. I'm a social worker myself by background, having practiced in the UK from the 1990s onwards, but worked internationally since 2000 in many different roles in sort of social work strengthening, capacity building. Yeah, so next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, if you could go back, I wanted to do this step by step. Yeah, so just keep that one on for now. So just the first step really is just to say that this is really recognizing that the wider social service workforce has professional social workers at its heart, but also works with paraprofessionals, who we broadly define as people providing social services in their professional capacity, but they may not have a training or qualification as a social worker. They may not have any degree or specialization, but they will have received specific training, and they're normally paid to some extent, and they have supervision ideally. And then you have community volunteers who are obviously typically unpaid, but where they are trained and supervised and specifically tasked in the provision of social services, as opposed to a purely ad hoc role, but where they have a key role to play in providing social services. Then we also include them under this broader category of the social service workforce, akin to what you find in the health workforce, where we know that doctors are necessary but not sufficient. You know, doctors have to work with nurses and midwives and other specialities like physiotherapy and so forth. But then there are also you have community health workers who play a key role in raising awareness, in identifying needs, in referring people to sources of help. And that's very much the same way that paraprofessionals and community volunteers work at the local level, where there aren't professional social workers. So next, you could just the next click first. We can see. So that's trying to say that, you know, that they're necessary but not sufficient, so they have to work alongside others. And then if you could bring in the next part of the diagram. So this central part of the slide is really our overall framework. So that's a bit small there on the slide, but in any of the resources that you can find on our website, socialserviceworkforce.org, will include these three headings: planning, developing, and supporting. So these are really the things that we focus on in our work, particularly with governments, generally through a partnership with UNICEF, but we also work with other funders, and previously we worked a lot with the US government support. You know, we're always trying to plan the overall workforce in terms of laws, policies, budgets, particularly most recently developing ratios, so trying to work out what is an appropriate ratio of social workers to a given population, and then being more specific than that in different roles. So how many do you need that are professionals? How many do you need that are paraprofessionals? How many do you need in different specialities? And then to a given population, to the overall population, or to a target population such as the child population, or even more specific than that, like persons with disabilities or migrants or something. So all those questions need to be determined when you're planning the workforce, and then making sure you have the resources for recruitment, hiring, and retention. And then in developing the workforce, it's really the education and training and the ongoing capacity building of the workforce. And then supporting the workforce is all around supporting their well-being, supervision, helping them deal with the stress, and making sure that there isn't burnout and high turnover in the workforce. So really the empowering and protecting the mental health of the profession as well, but also the key role of professional associations comes in there at the national level, making sure they are recognized and they can do their job in advocating for the workforce and supporting its work. And then next click, please, you'll see. So really, this is just a summary, which most of you will be very familiar with, but we always try and help others understand that when we're talking about the social service workforce, their roles vary from prevention roles, often working in the community, raising awareness and addressing risks before they sort of become serious, and trying to work initially with the families. For example, keeping children in the context of the family rather than them being placed in institutions. Similarly, with children with disabilities, preventing child protection risks before they escalate. Then there's also response and interventions, and then promoting is the category. And obviously, a lot of what social workers do around the world is in that response category, providing specific identifications in a casework way. And then promoting is more about the advocacy, raising awareness, and building understanding of the need for this kind of work in general. If you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so you can see on the left that this is really also to say that they operate at different levels. They operate at the micro level, which is specifically at the case level, the mezzo level, which is with communities, with groups, and also we see not just professional social workers, but researchers, academics, managers working at the macro level, which is sort of the national level or even the international level. And then if you click a bit further forward, so this is a slide I actually prepared more recently for a conference in Lithuania, which was ISPCAN, the International Society for Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, and they had a special event called the Rise Up Policy Forum on the back of that, and working with International Rescue Committee, we had a joint session looking at the role of the workforce in humanitarian situations, trying to understand that, you know, for many years, social workers developed in more stable contexts, and often it's positioned within what we broadly speak as development in sort of low and middle income countries. But also when it comes to responding to crises, natural disasters, conflict, other humanitarian situations, we often get first responders such as, you know, the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, or even that group, the International Rescue Committee, or other specialist INGOs. They come rushing in and they have their specialist staff, and they often unite with ministries of emergency or other first responders in the country, but often they might not think about the domestic social service workforce. And if that's a state in conflict or a fragile state, then it may be very hard to mobilize through ministries of social welfare, but there is often at the local level. So recently in Sudan, for example, despite the, you know, with the vacuum of political power, there were still social workers on the ground, often volunteers and paraprofessionals, but they were working through informal networks and they were organizing themselves. So the point we were making in this session was we really need to recognize the role that the workforce plays in very many different situations, including in response to the effects of climate change, conflict, migration, displacement, etc. And then we were trying to define what kind of roles they perform. So there is the role of assessing and planning, and obviously that is very much seen within a case management lens, albeit sometimes people focus too much on the case management and think that that's the only thing that needs to be strengthened. And sometimes international agencies, humanitarian agencies in particular, have tended to just isolate case management as if that's a service in itself. But actually, you know, as social workers, we would say, well, you know, social workers live and breathe case management. That's what we do with a lot of our work, but we don't see it as something separate. We see it as an approach, and we want really to prioritize strengthening social work as a profession and an approach, rather than just case management as a somehow separated function. But clearly we do need to have systematic approaches to case management, and that very much focuses on individual cases, but also the way it's organized in communities, and then having a national system for case management, including information management system. If you click on the next one, you can see that the other thing is recognizing that so much of what the social service workforce does is around connecting, referring and coordinating. So making sure that individuals and families are connected to sources of help through referrals, then make sure that there are interagency, inter-service protocols and procedures for referrals at the community level or the district level. And then at national, you have a coordinating body and a coordinating system to make sure that we connect people to help that they need. So I think that if anybody asks what's the key difference between a social worker and another profession in the helping field, like a psychologist or a counselor, you would probably agree with me that a lot of it is around this issue of connecting, making sure that people get the help they need from multiple different services, and doing that in the community. So not from behind a desk, but, you know, we start from behind a desk, but we go out into the community. We make sure that the help is received once referrals are made. It's not just that we make a telephone or letter referral or email referral, and then we drop them and they carry on and hope that they go on. We actually make sure they're getting the service they need and follow up and review that case plan as needed. And then the next one, if you click again, I think this is really vital right now, and I think it'd be interesting to discuss this in the groups that follow. We're going to be looking at the issue of politicization and polarization and increasingly lack of trust. So I think that the social service workforce, in a non-political way, but it's really key to building trust back up again at the micro level between individuals, even within the same family, between families, people in conflict within that community, between individuals and service providers, whether they be NGOs or governmental. And then at the mezzo level, that trust needs to be built or restored between communities, between services and departments, and often even between warring factions. And then at national level of between nations, I think that, you know, the Commonwealth Organization is a great example of how we also have a role to play in building and restoring trust in a very practical way rather than in a highly political, a polemic way. So if you could move to the next slide, I think I'm nearly done. So a little acronym there, ACT, just to remind you. So I think that assess, connect, and build trust is an important way of looking at, but I actually would say there's another letter there, R, which is to say that relational welfare, a lot of the debates and discussions I've attended recently, people have been making the point that it was great that, you know, in the 90s and 2000s, we were very much focused on building systems like child protection systems and social protection systems, but we mustn't in that neglect the relational side, so the relational welfare, and realizing that however strong a system is, it's going to be no good in terms of providing useful help and relevant help if it's not also based on a strong relational aspect of the welfare, the human interpersonal aspect. So just this slide is a rather complicated one. So given lack of time, I'm not going to dwell on it for long, but just to say that really it's trying to show that the social service workforce, which very much includes social workers at their heart, includes many different roles. In fact, I was in a conference in Mozambique recently with the National Association of Social Workers and only discovered at the end that although the conference was all about social work, there's nobody there that actually has the title or the direct translation of the title social worker. So it's almost like we spend the 3 days talking about social work and nobody's a social worker. And that's often because there's such a plurality of titles and sometimes even a fear of using the term social worker or the direct translation because it sounds like manual laborer or laborer and it sounds low status in translation, and people prefer a term like social welfare officer, specialist, child protection specialist, official, all sorts of probation and social welfare. So many different titles, but actually they all have slightly different meanings. And so, but they often, we need a range of different functions in the broader social service workforce, thinking about sort of child and youth care workers, which is another recognized function in many countries, community leaders and mobilizers, and also specialist roles in terms of social protection and making sure people get access to welfare payments, cash transfers, and other forms of social protection. The other thing that this diagram shows is that it's multi-level. As I mentioned before, you have people who have just a maybe secondary school education, but they are playing a key role either as a volunteer or as a paraprofessional, but then you can move up to people who have a technical diploma or a university degree. They may be at a basic level of specialization or advanced level, and there should be career pathways for people to move up, but united by a set of common competencies, which are some examples of which are at the bottom in pink, but also every country should work out what is their core competency framework that would unite your wider social service workforce. And the bit in green is just a recognition that there are allied sectors like health, education, and justice, where their professionals are not social service workers. So a teacher, a policeman, a doctor is not a social service worker as such, but what they do is essential to ensuring that people are protected and receive support. And then equally, we do often have members of the social service workforce, including social workers, positioned in those sectors. So working in hospitals, in schools, in clinics, sometimes even in the court system, sometimes in youth offending institutions of different types, and trying to focus on rehabilitation. So clearly there is an overlap and a key connection with what we call allied workforces there. If we move to the, I think I'm nearly done in terms of my slides. Just very briefly, you can click through all of these. It's just a way of showing that there's building blocks. I think the whole point of this slide is to show that if we want to, if you could just go back, if we want to build our social service workforce, and particularly to professionalize social work, which I think is a key aspiration, I'm sure, of your members, then there are a number of different building blocks that we need to think about, and we have to think, are these in place? So At the very top, do we have a national strategy, and do we have a national leadership group that unites people from different ministries and from universities and other key international and national NGOs? At the very bottom, is this all underpinned by laws and policies? In other words, the normative framework. Have we assessed the needs? Have we developed the costing and the ratio? Have we looked at the code of ethics? Have we developed that? Do we have minimum standards, quality standards? Is that linked to a competency framework? Do we have a system for supervision and practice education and standards for education? And then are we testing competency? Do we have a system for issuing and renewing licenses? And what happens if someone is considered to be not meeting the standards? So really, there's a whole ecosystem that we need to think about when we're talking about strengthening the social service workforce. Yeah, next slide, please. That's all right. Yeah, so this is my final slide. It's really just to say, as I adapt this to different audiences and different situations, that we often find, unfortunately, a negative spiral when it comes to recognition and support for the social service workforce, particularly for professional social work within that. So a very common finding, and my organization has been involved in mapping and assessing the workforce in many different countries and regions, but typically we find low salaries and poor working conditions combined with weak regulation of the work, and that results in a low status and in turn less recognition and respect from the general population, from employers, even from parents who discourage their children from going into social work, from clients who don't know what a social worker is and don't want to work with one. And then in turn, that has a low quality of output from studying and education of graduates. The practice is lower, and then you get failure to provide and respond. The VIC is actually violence against children from an older presentation, but it could be failure to prevent and respond to whichever needs there are that the social workers are trying to address. But we can flip it in the positive spiral if we invest into adequate salaries, better working conditions, stronger regulation, then we boost the status of the overall profession. That in turn leads to public recognition and respect, but we need to have national campaigns to bring to the attention of the public what a social worker does. You'll never see them on Netflix. You see policemen, lawyers, doctors all the time, but social workers never get the publicity that they should have. So we need campaigns to actually raise the visibility and understanding of the profession. And that in turn will drive people going into university at higher quality, coming out with higher quality, improving the quality of practice, and ultimately better outcomes for the people that we are working with. So I'll leave that with you. I hope that's been helpful, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Yu. That was brilliant. Thank you very much. So what we'll do is I'll move over into my presentation now. So what I prepared my work on was to explore this whole focus on UK children's social work. And my presentation is titled Navigating UK Children's Social Work in Challenging Times. What can we gain from being part of the Commonwealth networks? So what I started off doing is just to illustrate the different contexts in which children's social workers operate in within the UK. So social workers the majority of the social workers tend to be working in social work-led employment, and you'll find them located within the community, so that is geographically linked, or it could be based on the community of interest. So you'll find UK social workers speak of their practice context in relation to working with children with disabilities, or they could be in other specialist teams that is specifically related to a particular community of interest. Some social workers will be based in what is called a functional team. And what that means is that you'll hear social workers in the UK say that they are working in child protection or out of hours duty. Some social workers may say they are in the look after children team. What that essentially means is that they are working with children who are perhaps in foster care or linked with social work services. And so these are some examples of specialist teams that are functioning according to where the child is within the child welfare system. There are some social workers in the UK who are working within a multidisciplinary team. So what that means is that teams like the youth offending team will have a social worker that is located within a particular team, but then that social worker would be working in, and will have colleagues in the same building and in the same office who is maybe a police officer, a drug and alcohol worker. So they are working within a multi-agency team. Some social workers would be seconded or working directly within schools, within hospitals, within CAFCAS. CAFCAS is a specialist term we use for very senior social workers who work within the family court environment. And the aim of the CAFCAS worker is to work very closely with a child who may be caught up within a custodial dispute between two parents. And so the CAFCAS social worker, who's also called, another title is a guardian. So the social worker in that particular context is working with a child to find out more sensitive details in terms of who the child prefers to live with, mother, father, mum or mom. So it really depends on the nature of the family, but the child's wishes and feelings and interests are being taken into consideration by the CAFCAS social worker. And then social workers could also work within residential settings. So I think this slide I just created for some colleagues of us on the call who may not be familiar with the different kind of context of UK social work, because I do know that there are some colleagues, perhaps just like myself, who have come from a different country. I'm from South Africa, and I came over to the UK. And so for me, it was to find out the different context of social work working, and then you are in a far better position to ascertain which particular areas of social work may be of interest to you. So what I wanted us to think about in terms of UK social work, but I'm pretty sure this is also highly relevant to you in your country where you're from. Perhaps it varies to different degrees, but essentially social workers are now in a situation where we are having to have a better understanding of human rights. And when you work with children in that particular context, what particular challenges or opportunities these particular practice contexts bring about. So we are faced with some unique challenges. And what that means is when we deal with issues with regards to immigration, because some colleagues may be working with children who are refugees or asylum seeking, or they from just international context, and they now within the UK context, social workers has to have a stronger understanding of immigration mixed with a knowledge and understanding of welfare. And so this nexus that we find ourselves in can be sometimes a very contentious kind of issue. And I think it was really important for us to focus on this a lot closer, because sometimes within our work context, we hardly talk about these particular issues. And sometimes at university, our modules don't necessarily cover some of this kind of important information. And so I'm really grateful for you to be on the call, because we are going to look at this together and then try to deliberate how we can overcome some of the challenges immigration welfare issues could bring about. I think one of the key things when it comes to human rights is that social workers should really critically think about human rights and social justice, what the consequences are of that, and more importantly, when we're dealing with children and families who are subjected to immigration control, what does that look like in our practice? How do we make sense of these particular issues? And then more importantly, what does that mean for me as a social worker, or yourself? In what's our individual positioning with regards to immigration control? How do we feel about it? And in order for us to make sense of that, it's important that we are reflective and we also reflexive, because we need to assess and evaluate our own attitude and our practices regarding these policies where we're dealing with people who are being marginalized but also find themselves in precarious circumstances because of perhaps like political wars or seeking asylum in the UK. How do we feel about it as social workers? The other challenge UK social workers find themselves in is the reality that because of globalization and dealing with immigration issues, we're now working within an emergingly diverse society. And I mean, it's beneficial because we learn about different cultures, but we also are expected as UK social workers now to start thinking about what does parenting look like and what are those particular harmful parenting behaviors that can sometimes clash with safeguarding issues. So here we talk about some challenges that deals with female genital mutilation, honor-based violence. Those are kind of the challenges that social workers are nowadays being presented with. So we need to therefore have a stronger working knowledge of what it is about and what it is we can do about the circumstances to ensure that safeguarding needs are being met. And then the other issue also just to highlight here is that for us to get this to an extent right and comfortable, these kind of platforms, these webinars, these kind of communications with practitioners across Commonwealth nations and across specialisms is really important. So I'm looking forward to the breakout room discussions we'll have later, but these are some of the things we'll explore. One of the key things I did want to highlight for us is for us to talk and think about the impacts of the hostile environment policy that we have currently in the UK, and especially in England. What has happened was in 2014 and 2016, there is a policy called the Hostile Environment Policy that was introduced. It's now called the Compliant Environment Policy, but essentially it is still it's still very hostile when you start exploring exactly what this policy is doing. So what this policy is seeking to do is to develop a range of strategy to restrict illegal immigration, but also in the process, one of the consequences is that it also powerfully constructs a milieu that positions certain groups as undeserving of state support and denial of access to basic rights. And this has profound consequences, and I'll illustrate what I mean in the next few slides. So one of the implications is that various families are faced with destitution. This therefore increases the family's vulnerability, especially of women who some of them are on spousal or partner visas. And as a result of this, when they find themselves in a relationship where there's domestic violence, they are at risk of potential exploitation, because what research has shown is that some women feared that they could lose their children or their immigration status if they leave their abusive partner. So we have a difficult situation where in some circumstances, the predominant social group that this affects tend to be women. And then on top of it all is the reality that with this hostile environment policy, for many mothers, they also do not have any recourse to public funds. So they cannot necessarily access the welfare benefits, because the welfare benefits in itself is limited. And even though they are entitled to Section 17 provision, according to, like the Children Act 1989, they can't necessarily access that Section 17 provision because it is limited already. There's not a lot of funds. And so social workers are finding themselves in a really difficult situation where they have to determine how they're going to spend the welfare budget that's been given, that is already not meeting the needs of the British public, on top of the duty and the responsibility we do have to ensure that families who are from immigrant background have the required support. So it is a real challenge that UK social workers are facing. What it also means is, because what the research is saying is because the mothers are staying in domestic violent relationships, it means that their children, sadly, they're in a difficult situation where they're continually exposed to potential risk and the devastating incomes of living within a domestic violent home. And so within the school context, these are again challenging circumstances that are being experienced by school social workers that also see the harmful impacts of this. So families with no recourse to public funds are in a precarious situation of exploitation and domestic violence, and that is just one particular area. Some of us on the call may know that there are health surcharges, fees that has to be paid. So people can't necessarily go and access the GP or the health services when they feel poorly. They have to pay for those particular services. So it's important for us to sort of, when we do our social work assessments and we work with families, we have to establish what access to health and other resources it is they have. So it's therefore crucial that UK social workers have statistical oversight of immigration details so that we can better contextualise the work we are doing and when we are doing our risk assessments in particular. There are no official records indicating how many people have irregular immigration status. However, one study estimated that in 2017, there were between 800,000 and 1.2 million people who were living in the UK without leave to remain, including people seeking asylum. In 2021, there were approximately 224,000 children under the age of 18 who were subjected to no recourse to public funds. And so that is another point we need to highlight. I need to just move on a bit quicker. So moving on to the other challenge we're facing, this reality of the rise of the far-right politics. So what we are finding in the UK is, and I know in other parts of the world, this is a similar situation that is arising, but we have the rise of the right-wing populism, and it has, and we have to consider the impact this has on inclusive welfare also, because we know that social work as a profession, we have these fundamental principles of universalism. You know, we are about social justice, and we are driving practices that should be inclusive. But what is happening with right-wing populism is that the right wing is advocating for exclusions of access to welfare. There is social discrimination and some social groups are being ostracized. And so it has become a really, really contentious issue when we think about the welfare agenda and the rise of far-right politics. We also implicitly assuming that social workers, they are immune to right-wing populist positions because they are social workers. And when we join the profession, we ought to ascribe to social justice values. However, research is showing, and there are several researchers who's done research in this area, and they say that there are amongst our social workers and social work students who explicitly support right-wing populist thoughts. And this is worrying. But it's also not surprising because when I look at my own research that look into the experiences of racism experienced by Black, Asian, ethnic minoritized families, there's an increase in research showing racialized social work practices. So that is no surprise, therefore, when I consider this body of academic evidence suggesting that social workers and social work students, to some extent, are supportive of right-wing thinking. So scholars have highlighted how the contemporary social, political, and economic changes that is happening within our society to an extent have bearing and influence our own identities as social workers. So this assumption of social workers being immune to right-wing populist attitudes, we have to question it, and supervision is crucial. I know there's time constraints and supervision sometimes go on the back burner, but more than ever, supervision is crucial to fact check where people are at with regards to what's happening in our society. So social workers' own experiences and their feelings can cause them to turn towards right-wing populist positions. And part of that is consideration for the overall welfare agenda that we do have to take into consideration, because this is an important arena where you can amplify what is going wrong in the country and who's more deserving of support, as opposed to nipping things in the bud and ensuring that we are still ascribing to the values of social work, where we include
something I'm listening online.
Sorry, can I ask you to turn your mic off, please? Thank you. So one of the welfare agendas we have to consider is the UK child poverty and social work aspect. So the sad reality is that the poverty statistics in the UK is frightening. There are, firstly, various studies that acknowledges there's a significant link between poverty and parenting, and how deprivation diminishes a parent's capacity to parent. That is the reality. Yet my question is, do we bear that in mind to an extent when we work with families who are in poverty? To what extent are we able to consider and be poverty aware when we do our assessments? Because statistically, what it's saying is that more than 1 in 5 people in the UK, so 21%, were in poverty in 2022, 2023. So that is 14.3 million people. And of these, 4.3 were children. So to put it another way, around 3 in every 10 children are living in poverty in the UK. And statistically, what it also says is that the poorest family, those living in deep poverty, had an average income that was 57% below the poverty line, with this gap increasing by almost 2/3 over the past 25 years. So things are tough. So the deepest and most damaging form of poverty we get is what's called destitution. And destitution is where people cannot afford to meet their most basic physical needs to stay warm, dry, clean, and fed. So even though the UK is considered to be a first world country, there are citizens who are facing destitution. So the latest destitution in the UK report stated that around 3.8 million people experienced destitution in 2022, including around 1 million children. And these figures have more than doubled since 2017. So this deepening poverty has also been reflected by increasing numbers of people and families, especially using food bank, where they go to a particular building on an organization that hands out food parcels, emergency food parcels. And the Trussell Trust Network is one of those key charities that's playing a fundamental role alongside the welfare services we have in the local authorities. In October 2024, around 2.6 million of the poorest fifth of households, that is 44% people, were in arrears with their household bills, or they were behind on scheduled lending repayments. 4.1 million, that is 69%, were going without essentials. And 3.2 million households, that is 54%, were cutting back on food, or they went hungry. In addition to that, to exacerbate matters even more, there's increasing household costs and frozen levels of support. That really complicates the extent to which they can get state support. Also, the basic rate of benefits is only being maintained at a level around the threshold for destitution, and this will continue to hold living standards back. So times are tough. So as social workers, we now are faced with a different layer of complex safeguarding dilemmas, because we have a welfare circumstance, which I have just outlined through the child poverty statistics, but then we also have an emergently diverse society, and it's within these particular practice contexts, there are some challenges, but there are opportunities for learning. And that's why webinars like this is really important, because we're going to try to become solution focused. We're not going to stay powerless, but we have an obligation to move forward. What we also have to recognize is that many parents, including minoritized Black and ethnic parents, they are experiencing complex and multiple physical and emotional stresses that make them even more likely to struggle with what we as social workers are expecting to see ideal parenting according to Western norms. This is something that has to be challenged. And it's also the reality that minoritized Black and ethnic parents, they are facing intersectional layers of oppression due to structural disadvantages that we have within our society. Some social workers, understandably, are doubting whether they can deliver meaningful interventions, given the limited resources that are made available through, government funding. And there's also another key issue that has to be flagged for discussion, this possible misrecognition of the effects of poverty and what these kind of repercussions poverty has on families. Some social workers would come from working class background and know to an extent what poverty looks like and how it's impacting people. But there will be some social workers who are perhaps middle class that haven't got lived experience or critical understanding of how poverty affects people. And so it's really important that we ensure that our levels of training and education empower everyone to make accurate social work assessments. So it's important that social workers become poverty aware and therefore ground their approach in the family's lived experiences of poverty, and relationship-based social work is important. So there should be an acknowledgement that we all have shared history of colonialism, and we're all dealing with the effects of it still. But it's important that we need to reframe social work's identity to include the international context in which we're working, and we adopt solution-focused approaches. We need to we need to negate practices of cultural superiority and acknowledge that all parts of the world has something to offer and has knowledge that we can benefit of. And we need to learn good practice and indigenous responses to child poverty, because I'm sure people have great ideas of what that look like. And so today it was about just acknowledging this shared spaces we've got for discussion. So that is the end of my presentation. And I'm just looking to see if Satish is on the call. No, he's not. So I'm going to hand over to you. Gavin, did you want to come on the call, please?
Yes, thank you, Carleen.
I'll just ignore me. You can start talking, and then I'll
find my place on the slide deck.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Well, hello everybody. Just to brief introduction. My name is Gavin Morgan. I'm a social worker. I'm based in England, in the UK. I'm a British citizen. I'm also a Mauritian citizen, and of Tamil descent. So if anybody isn't sure about what that means, it's so my family would have originated at some time in the past from South India, from the Tamil Nadu region, and I think I might have seen some people who may be from that neck of the woods as well in this call today. But what I'm going to do is just talk just for the next few minutes about what unites us as a profession and what's potentially transferable. I am going to talk about a particular area that I've worked in recently. My practice background actually began in adult social work, and then I found myself very quickly going from adult social work in the field of substance misuse to children's social work, and I found myself working in maternity, child protection, family courts, and then in more recent years I found myself working in a professional association, in BASW, the British Association of Social Workers, and more recently I've been working in the field of regulation. But I'm going to speak to you in my own capacity today, not as in any particular employed role. Now, that last picture that you might have just seen in that last slide on the right, that is actually taken in my dad's village in Mauritius. I just thought I'd share that with you, and it means a lot to me in terms of my own personal lived experience. But there's a reason I've shown you that as well. But but we can move on now, Carleen. To the next slide. So some of you might recognize this poster from one of the social work day events most recently, and I think some of the words that really sort of like come out here is this point about enduring well-being and strengthening intergenerational solidarity for enduring well-being. And I wanted to talk a little bit, or just make reference to the global definition of social work, and that has been agreed upon, and also the principle here of that global definition. The global definition you can find on the International Federation of Social Workers website, but this point here about the overarching principles of social work are about the respect, inherent worth and dignity of human beings, and this idea about doing no harm, and this point about diversity and human rights and social justice, all the kind of things that hopefully communicate very clearly to us all, and it's part of our DNA as social workers. But as we go to the next slide now, I'm just going to first of all, this image is an image of a camp where asylum seekers are living in a particular country in the Commonwealth. I'm going to be careful because I'm not here to name and shame any particular place, but what I want to just make reference to now, as well as you've heard about my background. One of the things that I currently do is I do a number of roles as an independent social worker, and it includes doing immigration assessments. So partly following on from what we've already heard from Carleen. But what I wanted to say is I've recently done some work with two brothers who are in who are asylum seekers from another part of the world, and they are in a different country to the one that I'm in at the moment, but they're in a Commonwealth country as asylum seekers, and they're living in very difficult circumstances. And the reason that I was assessing them was because they have a relative in this country, in the UK, and so there's a link here, and they're seeking to live here. And what was quite difficult to hear as part of the assessment, their current living circumstances are very poor. They're living with another relative in a single room in a refugee camp. There is no running water. There is no there's very limited electricity, little food, clothing, no education. And when I spoke to them, there was very little joy and even hope for the future, and the big worry, to add to that, as well as their lives effectively being on hold, is that there is a risk of them being returned to their country of origin. These are both children who are orphaned. Their father was murdered by the government, by people associated with the government in their country of origin. Their mother has also passed away since then, and so they're orphaned, and the closest relative they have, who they have access to, is currently in the UK. So as part of the assessment, it was very clear that these are very vulnerable children. But one of the things that really stood out to me was that, you're thinking again as well about what Carleen's made reference to, is we are seeing this rise of the far right. We're seeing these very strong policies which are anti-immigration, and yet one of the things that really I personally find difficult, is particularly with thinking about my social work compass, my social work values, is that I could be working with some children here in England, and where I have the same worries about their safety, about their prospects, but they will have certain rights that they should expect. And education, safety, clothing, food, all those things that really they should be able to take for granted. But just purely on the basis of where these children are based, there's no real collective responsibility, even though they're within our Commonwealth and in a Commonwealth country. And that's the situation we're in. And as we move to the next slide now, this is something. This image is really stock markets. You know, the kind of thing that you might have seen in the news. But the reason I'm just making reference to that is I remember when the credit crunch came, when we had a financial downturn in 2008, 2009, and what we saw is countries coming together, working together to come up with a good global response. And we saw the same with COVID as well. Not all perfect. There were all sorts of mistakes made, but we saw countries coming together and making decisions. And yet, when we're talking about these humanitarian crises, it feels like it's the opposite. We're going into this very protectionist approach where and we're dispensing of what should be a global responsibility. And that's one of the real worries here. And you know, this idea of you know, there's a politicization of people's of the current issues going on here. And what you have is, as a social worker, you're going into situations like this, and you're working against the grain depending on where certain people live. But as we move to this final slide, what I want to say is I don't just want this to sound as me just having a complaint really about the situation we're finding us in. It's really up to us in many of these situations, just like the one example I've just talked to about, to be looking at solutions. I do think, and this poster is from another event previously to the last one, first a social work international social work event, and this was looking at co-building a sustainable and just future. Really want to focus on this idea of a just future and our responsibility in looking at that. And it shouldn't be just on the basis of where you live, because that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that the value of human life varies depending on where you are and who you are. Great social work is about that intervention where we are going in, we're looking at how we safeguard, how we use the relevant laws and legislations and policies and approaches to ensure children like the one that I've got get the service that they need, that they are properly safeguarded and do receive the basic and the minimum. But there's something about our influence as well. And influence, it could be influence on a practice level, where, but ensuring that we use our professional influence, our judgment to be heard, and so we can advocate, and also being aware of that context as well. So the context in one part of the world might differ from the other, and we need to respond and react to that, so the children and the families we work with get the service that they need. And the final point here that I want to make is this idea about a collective response. We can do things individually. We can produce that great social work, that great relational social work, and that advocacy social work, and have that influence that we need to have. But there's also something about the collective response. I do think that, you know, things like the Commonwealth and also beyond that, we should be able to expect a minimum. But actually, we're working in difficult times, and we need to be coming together, I think, through groups like this and through our respective influence in groups, you know, could be associations, to actually have a more global effect, to ensure that we can have the appropriate fairness and safeguarding, and ensure that the children and families that we work with get the service that they need. Those are the key points I really wanted to get across. Yeah, Carleen, back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.